I'd like to call this meeting to order this Tuesday, February 16th, this regular City Council work session. The clerk will call the roll.
Mayor Wolcott.
Here.
Vice Mayor Biendo.
Here.
Councilmember Tandy.
Here.
Councilmember Hall.
Here.
Councilmember Villanueva.
Here.
Councilmember Williams.
I am here.
Councilmember Winters.
Here.
Thank you.
If you'll all please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, we have a singular item for this afternoon's agenda. I believe that's going to be presented by you, Lindsay. And Jared.
This is a presentation and discussion pertaining to the capital-related revenue and an overview of the fiscal year 2017 capital budget process.
Good evening, Madam Chair, members of the council. Last time out, we talked with you about our operating revenues for the upcoming budget cycle. Tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about our capital side of the house. So both a review of our capital revenues and also the process that we're going to be going through this fiscal year. A couple of the key things on our capital discussion. First of all, capital projects right now are defined as anything that's greater than $100,000 and has a useful life of 3 years or more. So in our current capital plan, I'll call it a capital plan even though it's really only a one-year plan right now. Our current capital plan has projects as diverse as a $108,000 park and ride enhancement all the way up to a $21 million clubhouse renovation. So there are a lot of different items that get captured in the capital projects. Additionally, we have our asset replacement and maintenance items. These include pavement preservation, our vehicle replacement, and then individual department asset replacements. Each of these programs could have individual items that are less than $100,000, but the majority of the items do have a useful life of greater than 3 years. The reason why we have both of these items together is because they compete for the same dollars as far as the capital plan is concerned. One of the things we're going to be looking to do this year is create a more robust multi-year plan, and a couple of the things we're going to be doing is going through and doing a little bit better job of prioritizing our projects with council. We're also going to talk a little bit more about the revenues and the decisions that we have available to us on the capital side. And for tonight's discussion, we're going to boil it down to really four major types of revenue. We have direct revenues, which include contracting, sales tax, and development impact fees. Indirect revenues, which are both operating savings and operating surpluses. Outside revenues, which we would receive from grants or other regional funding. And then there's borrowing, both by council action and also by election. This pie chart here represents the funding that we have available in fiscal year 2016, $78 million total, including both $64 million in capital improvement plan items, and then an additional $14 million of asset replacement in the current fiscal year. You can see 70% of that is made up of fund balance. So these are revenues that were received in prior years and either due to carry forward projects that weren't completed in the previous year, or in the case of some bond proceeds we received last year for the clubhouse renovations. Those were received last year and are carried forward to this year. So the majority of the fund balance is either for carry forward items or for the clubhouse renovations. The rest of what you see here, the 30%, is new revenue that is used for capital purposes. And you can see that the largest of those three available there is the indirect revenues that we get from our operating funds, about 20%. Direct revenues make up 8%, outside revenues 2%, and you'll notice that borrowing is missing in this fiscal year, but as I mentioned, last fiscal year we borrowed approximately $18 million towards the clubhouse renovations. Our first revenue type we'll talk about is direct revenue. For 2016, that makes up $6.1 million. This is funding that's dedicated for one-time purposes. Sources are driven by growth and considered volatile. So as we have high growth years, we see high revenue collections, and when we have low growth years, it's low revenue collections. Because of that, we like to dedicate this towards one-time uses instead of operations. Otherwise, we'd have to be modifying our operations up and down as these revenue sources would be going up and down. Last time we talked a little bit about contracting sales tax. It's got a rate of 3.7%. It takes about 120 days for us to change that rate. Currently, that's the highest rate of the comparable cities that we brought forward last time. It's split between the general capital fund and transportation improvement. Additionally, the general capital fund and the general fund split the 2.2% share that goes to general fund. The first $1.25 million is used for operations. Anything above that is used for capital purposes. Currently, there's some legislation out there. Right now, we're hearing it's 99% dead, but anything can happen when the legislature is still at work. The first was a reduction in base from 65% to 55% of the sale price. So when something is sold, what they do is they say 65% of that amount can be taxed at your rate, which is 3.7%. There was some legislation that was going to reduce that to 55%. It's about a 15% reduction in our revenue collections, which would have been approximately $725,000. The key thing here is because of the policy that states the first $1.25 million is used for operations, that entire reduction would have been felt on the capital side because would have been the last $725,000 that came through the door. Additionally, there's still some talk about point of sale, which is to charge the sales tax where the supplies are purchased. That is a little bit harder to determine how much that would impact us. Right now, it sounds like it's going to be pushed off to a study group, but we should expect to see it. If it doesn't return this year, we should expect to see it probably return in the future. Our other source of revenue, direct revenue, is development impact fees. Again, discussed last time we were talking about the operating side, 18 to 24 months to make changes here. We are expecting to make an update this summer. We're going to begin that update this summer. These are fees that are collected on the issuance of a building permit, and they're restricted in use, both by project type. So we have police, fire, parks, water, wastewater, among other entities that have specific uses. Can be used for new growth only. So if we're building a new facility, but a portion of it is replacing an old facility, we actually have to come up with funds other than development impact fees to fund that portion. Additionally, development impact fees have some debt service responsibilities. So we have some projects that we built in the past that we dedicate development impact fees towards first. We want to do the new study to ensure both the correct pricing and projects are included in the study. But remember, the key driver for this revenue is growth. It's not expected that the rates are going to increase that much, and really it would be dependent on growth to see a lot of additional revenue from this source. Next, we have indirect revenue, $15.7 million in fiscal year 2016. This is funding that's transferred from operating sources such as the general fund or the highway user revenue fund or the utilities. Two major types, operating savings. So these are funds that were saved from the prior fiscal year. These can be identified during the budget process or can be updated after the budget is approved. So last fiscal year, when we were putting together the 2016 budget, we identified some savings that we put towards asset replacement. Then after the fiscal year was completed, during this current fiscal year in the fall, we came back and said we had some additional savings and we dedicated that towards additional asset replacement and vehicle replacement as well. Operating surpluses, on the other hand, are when our operating sources, so our revenues that come in on the operating side, exceed our ongoing uses. So the example that I have here is last year when we were going through the budget process and we were talking about the property tax rate. We made the decision that we would keep the rate steady at 0.7591 per $100 of assessed valuation. That generated an additional $250,000 that we then dedicated for the use of pavement preservation. So that's an example of when you create an operating surplus for the purposes of completing capital projects. We usually create these during the budget process. We can do it during the fiscal year, but it's usually best to do it during the budget process. Outside revenues, totaling $1.3 million for fiscal year 2016. These are project-specific funds received from other entities. Some projects are completed by those other entities and they don't appear in our budget. So for instance, the work that was done on State Route 303 or the Bell and Grand interchange will not show up in our budget, but certainly we're going to see the effects of the $60 million spent at Bell and Grand and the $45 to $50 million spent on State Route 303. We received grants and other regional funding from Homeland Security, Tribal Gaming, the Community Development Block Grants, and Regional Transportation Plan and Prop 400 on the transportation side. A couple key things on outside revenue, especially grants. It's a couple different ways you can look at this. We can either prioritize our projects based on the availability of funding. So we look at what funding is available and say what projects can we plug into that. Or we prioritize our projects based on our need, and then we seek the funding. If you do the first, you're going to maximize potentially your outside funding that you have. The problem is you may not actually complete projects that are of the highest need for you. There's usually a match component with these projects, so we will have to make the decision in some cases that we will forego a higher priority project in order to fund something to unlock some additional outside revenue. Finally, we have borrowing. In 2016, as I mentioned before, no dollars were budgeted. Borrowed funds are repaid from operating funds over time. Essentially, this converts one-time expenses into ongoing expenses, and it should not be backed by a volatile source. Two major types. First is through council action. We have revenue obligation bonds, municipal property corporation bonds outstanding currently. These were both done through council action alone. These items are backed by current taxing fee and rate authority. So the items that we discussed last week as far as making changes to sales tax or property tax or our rates, those are the types of things that would back additional bonds in this area. The key thing that you have to remember is if we borrow this money, we have to have a way to pay it back. And that's either through reductions in expenses or from increasing in revenue. One of the things we did last year when we refinanced some of our debt is we freed up some additional availability of funds that allowed us to do the clubhouse renovations, for instance. And finally, we have elections. This takes about 120 days for council action needs to take action for an election to occur 120 days before the election. Right now, that would be June 21st based on our current schedule of council meetings. Two major types. Really, the general obligation bond is the one that we've talked about most, and this actually extends the property tax authority, so it, in a sense, creates its own revenue source. That revenue source, though, obviously falls back to council action to determine what that rate would be and how much revenue we would collect. One that's a little bit more focused is the Community Facilities District, and rather than an election, this is based on the property owners within a specific area. But a Community Facilities District works a lot like a general obligation bond in that it creates its own property tax authority and its own revenue source for repayment. So let's talk a little bit about the process that we're going to go through. First, prioritizing our projects. So we've gone through and we've split out our projects into 6 major categories: asset replacement, general government, parks and recreation, public safety, transportation, and utilities. You'll see that these categories match a lot of what was done last year with the Capital Funding Exploratory Committee. We're also going to use a lot of the input from them that we received to help us get a jump start on doing our priorities, along with staff input that was begun last fiscal year and will continue as we go forward. Next, we'll have some decisions on revenue, so same as the operating side, rates, policies, in this case, operating budget items, so identifying savings and surpluses within the operating funds in order to potentially fund some capital items. And finally, election, whether we go for an election or not. Two of the main things we want to get done at fiscal year 2017 capital budget. We've had annual capital budgets for the last few years. This is no different than we've had in the past, identifying what's going to get funded in fiscal year 2017. We're going to bring forward a recommended budget April 19th, and then we'll look to adopt the budget on June 21st. Next is a little bit different. We haven't really had a full multi-year capital improvement plan that's been adopted by council in some time. So we're looking to bring, these dates are a little bit more, I'll say, gray at this point. Right now, we're looking to bring forward a recommended capital improvement plan forward on May 17th. However, depending on how the discussions go with council, we may push that back. We're not forced to do an adoption of the capital improvement plan at any time, so it's a little bit different than what our 2017 budget timeframes are. We'd be looking then to bring an adopted CIP forward June 21st. A couple of key points is any areas that need further discussion, will just be adopted as contingency, and then we'll need council action to further clarify it. And again, all changes that we would make to the capital improvement plan would then require future action by council in order to make changes. Some of the upcoming events over the next 3 meetings will be coming forward during the work sessions to discuss our capital projects, to review them, review the prioritizations of those different categories. And then we'll be looking to bring a recommended, city manager's recommended 2017 capital plan with the April 19th recommended budget. Are there any questions?
Councilmember Williams.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm going to ask a dumb question and think out loud in public, which is a dangerous thing to do. But when you talked about the GEO bond, one of the factors that you alluded to, Jared, was servicing the debt and coming up with those. And with a CFD, it kind of pays for itself, correct? I mean, in an amateur way of describing that.
Madam Chair, Councilmember Williams, both the general obligation bond and the community facilities district operate similarly as far as the funding of that debt. They both allow for a separate rate to be charged to either the members of that district or the city at large in the case of the general obligation bond. And that tax can only be used for the purposes of servicing that debt. In the case of the CFD, there is a small amount that's allowed to go towards operations, about 30 cents per $100,000 or $100 of assessed valuation. Not really much to speak of, but they work very similarly in the way that they end up funding the debt service portion of it.
Okay. And just thinking out loud, can you do something across the board with the CFD? Could you have a pavement preservation community facilities district citywide, a parks and recreation CFD citywide to make those enhancements and improvements, or it wouldn't function in that manner? It would have to be like a Marley Park or a very specific area.
Madam Chair, Councilmember Williams, to establish that CFD, we would actually have to get the permission of all of the property owners in the district. So that would make it probably a little bit more difficult than possibly going out for an election for a general obligation bond.
Right.
Is it possible?
I told you it was going to be a dumb question.
It's possible. Very difficult.
There are no dumb questions.
Thanks, Jared.
No dumb questions. Any other questions? Did you have a question? No. Okay. It strikes me when you're going through the revenue resources, it strikes me how many of those revenue resources only impact cities and are under the microscope at the state capitol. So here we are trying to plan ahead, and it's troubling, obviously, that we have to do this every year, is spend a good amount of time just going down to the Capitol and defending our position of just staying kind of static and not, please don't hurt us, just keep it static, so that we can plan ahead and move forward. So, and I'm grateful that we have great staff that's been helping us down at the Capitol and getting some real movement on some of these issues. The one thing I did want to just say out loud is when it comes to prioritizing, I think that's a valid set of choices that you brought to our attention. Personally, when you prioritize projects based on the availability of funding, you inevitably leave the most needy things unfunded. And it's basically chasing the dollar, chasing the grant dollar, chasing the federal dollar. And to me, that does not make a whole lot of sense, especially when you're riding as close to the edge as we are, when we're very much a responsible city. We're very mindful of the taxpayers' dollars, and so we want to make every dollar count. And so knowing that there are so many needs out there, I would prefer that we think about seeking funding to help sustain those actual needs of our citizens, that and the organization itself. That seems to be the most pragmatic way of tackling that. So I can't speak for everybody else, but that's my own personal thought. So are there any other questions or comments?
I have a comment.
Councilmember Villanueva.
At what time are we allowed, or we're allowed, but to say what projects we have in mind? This is not the time, or when is going to be the time? Let's say we have an idea of some projects. When can we say that we'd like to have something done?
I would say, since we have time, Madam Chair, Councilmember Villanueva, I think we're open to suggestions now, and we'll definitely incorporate that as the staff is reviewing the projects and planning through that process, if there's a few that you'd like to throw out there.
I didn't hear you.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
We'd like to hear them now, if you'd like. We'll plan on that as we look at the projects and evaluate prioritization. So do you have some that you would like to share with us?
I have some, but I think I'd rather think about it as
Sure.
what I'm going to bring up. So I can do that a little bit later.
Councilmember, Vice Mayor Biondo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think the mayor raised a really interesting point about prioritization. How does one go about prioritization on what do we base it? And I think with Councilmember Villanueva's question also, it becomes part of that discussion. There may be certain projects that we have in mind, yet there may be some ongoing needs that are there. How do we create that full schedule so that we come to some sense of prioritization? I don't have an answer to that question. I'm just saying I think it's an interesting point that's being made that we're going to have to address somewhere along the way as we go through, because any number of us may have suggestions about projects. Now, where do these fit in that whole mix of ongoing capital projects as well?
Thank you, Vice Mayor. Councilmember Tandy.
Thanks. I don't know if you're prepared to share with us what the capacity of the city is to fund what level of projects this coming year, but I do see I see numbers of what we got for this budget, but that's not a sustainable number, is it?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Tanny, just looking at that pie chart, for instance, you can see that that's not a sustainable number going forward. So there's quite a few things that we're looking at right now as far as our capacity. One of the things is looking at current projects and what can or should be maybe reallocated to other items, that type of stuff. So I mean, that it's going more than just on the revenue side. So right now I can't say how much we have available. I can tell you it's not going to be a lot, which in some ways makes this exercise maybe a little bit easier, because it'll really sharpen our focus on what is the most important things. This is a good time for us to really get into this conversation and set our priorities. But at this point, I can't really say. I know that we're going to be having to dedicate a lot towards asset replacement. Those are some important items. So after we fund asset replacement, it's going to be difficult to get into a lot of other capital projects, most likely.
Right. My sense is that we saved up for several years, and people are going to see lots of street projects being done right now, but that's from saving for several years and planning and doing the designs, and it takes a long time to spin something up like this. So if people see additional streets or additional needs for parks or pools or anything like that, even if we were to go down the path of discussing right now and maybe finding a way to do it this year, even if we make that decision this budget season, we're still at least a year away from really designs starting to take off, and then a little bit more for procurement. And so we're still 2-3 years down the road, realistically, for, on an average or more. So what I kind of want to just share is this might be an opportunity. I don't think anybody really has the stomach for raising taxes this year to do this, or maybe the council does. If the citizens, because that's really the key, do the citizens want this now, or can they wait actually, if we don't do it this year, can they wait for 4 years? Because it's going to be pushing it off every year until we come up with a plan to do this. And that might be just, for discussion, rather than just fund 1 year at a time. At some point in time, I would like to get to multi-year plan discussion, and I don't know if this is the year. I don't know if this is the year the council would like to do that. But the key to me is, there needs to be enough citizen interest that these things have some value and need to proceed. And with the realization it's going to be, even when they have the value and share that with us, it's going to be many years down the road before some of these things happen, because everybody wants it done instantaneously, but that's just not how it works. It's a long process. If anybody looked at some of the designs and architectural plans or engineering plans for streets or facilities, very complex, takes time to do it, even after you get the funding. So I'm just trying to lay that out there for anybody who's listening, to try to put it in perspective of what we're doing and how fast we can do it. But I agree with you with a lower dollar amount for future years until we make a policy decision to make that money available. It's probably going to be difficult just to maintain existing assets, no real big projects. Now, I think a lot of citizens think big projects are needed, but do we have enough citizens that think big projects are needed and needed sooner than later? So again, we're looking at making a decision now for several years out. It can always be pushed off one more year, but that's going to be another year down on the other end. So just some of my thoughts.
Thank you, Councilmember. Councilmember Hall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A couple of things. You mentioned the study group, and I don't know if Nicole is plugged into that, but let's make sure that there's cities in that study group. I don't want a bunch of legislatures being in the study group and their staff or whatever. We need some city people.
Councilmember Hall, if I can clarify too, there is likely to be 2 study groups. The executive committee met last week, and we want the city of Surprise to be at the table, but we also want other cities, and we know that they will be. So we've already expressed that interest to the chair, but there's likely to be a study group that's led by the league, as well as an additional study group. So we will have at least 2 different prisms to look at the issue through.
And the other thing I want to comment on is that while we're going through all this prioritization, everything, I think we need to, just in general, we need to keep in mind what our residents have said they like about Surprise, and they want it to stay that way. And one is clean streets, well maintained. They've told us that in survey after survey after survey. Okay, so whatever we do, that needs to be a priority in my opinion. Okay, they've told us that they move here because it's a safe city. They want public safety. They want it emphasized. Okay, and they've told us that time again, time again. The third thing they've told us is that especially the families, not so much north of Bell because they got their own recreational facilities, but the families south of Bell love our Parks and Rec department and the services that we provide the families and the kids and all the rest of it. And all you have to do is go to 8 acres and witness that, or go to the stadium, and it's just it's part of quality of life in the city. And so I think those 3 things, in my opinion, we got to keep those in mind. I know there's other things. We got to replace cars here and there, and we need software improvement. I get that, but at the same time, I think we need to. We need to keep in mind what our residents think is important and what they want. And I think, like Councilman Tandy said, I think there's a lot of residents that have an appetite for maybe a secondary property tax if we're very strategic about it and we're very clear about it and they can see what they're going to get. Okay? But that's going to take time. We have to all make that decision whether we want to go to that election or not. But if we do, we need to make sure that our priorities are our residents' priorities, and we're delivering what they want, So that's my feedback. I haven't got anything in mind right now. I mean, anything specific, except that, I like well-maintained streets, clean streets, traffic lights that work. I like policemen that are well-maintained, that have got great equipment and are morale's high, and fire guys that the morale's high, and that. I can't tell you, I met a couple of fire guys today at lunch, and I thanked them for just what they do and all the compliments I get from residents that are unaided. I don't ask for them. They just come and say, boy, we got such a great fire department. Man, my husband fell down and they came and, they tell me this all the time. And I think that's a real plus in this city. is our fire and police, and we need to take care of them. And so, anyway, end of speech.
Councilmember Hall, I think you really hit the nail on the head. It is about the basics. Those are the basics that our residents like the most, and they continually share that with us. In addition to those basics, there are the basics that fundamentally help the city continue to maintain those basics. So we've got two sides of it. It's the operational side, and it's the delivery of those basics that the people actually see, touch, and feel every day. And we certainly all hear it, and we all hear the importance. And I think primary, always on our minds, is always public safety, and always will be, because that's one place that City of Surprise has always stood out, and we want to maintain that. So as we continue to grow, that's going to put additional pressures on our public safety operations. So we need to make certain that we are adequately funding those basic operations.
And some of it's capped.
True, absolutely. Yeah. Councilmember Tandy, did you have another comment?
Just as an example, we've got a lot of, for us, over the past 5 to 7 years, this is a lot of street projects for us, and I think it's fantastic. You know, people will probably, over the next couple of months, be a little tired of some of the street projects, but once they're done, I'm hoping they'll appreciate them. And the first one, I believe, got finished a couple of weeks early today on the Waddell, the median. So I saw the cones that were pulled off today, and so that's going to be a huge benefit. And I see a couple others starting to go. They're kind of staggered a little bit so that, you know, they don't all impact us. By the way, that Waddell one was one of those, how you mentioned, savings from other projects. All of our projects are bid out to the competitive bid, and if there's additional savings beyond what we estimate or budget, some of those can get reallocated. We also here in the City of Surprise like to have our developers pay for the streets when they first are put in. So I do hear a lot of comments, people that see the projects that are going on now. What I'm hearing is, well, when are the streets connecting the 303 going to get done? I hear that a lot. And the answer is when the developer builds, or if the city were to do that, we'd have to find the funding for it. We could go ahead and do that ahead of time rather than wait 4 years, because really they're not going to be done for 3 or 4 years if we don't take any action. Unless we have the developer take some action. And then we could lien the property and the developer could pay us back, and then we could do another project after that once we get the money back. So those are options for us, but I just want the citizens to have the right perspective of there isn't going to be much done in the next 3 or 4 years unless we take some kind of policy action. And again, I was a champion of doing that for last year because I didn't want to have a gap, the 3 or 4 year gap. But I realized that we really need to have the citizens interested in this. We didn't have enough citizen interest in, they were interested in the projects. They have to have enough interest to also pay for the projects, because that's the only way they will get done ahead of schedule unless the developers come in and do them earlier.
Timing is everything.
All right. See no further questions or comments? All right. So seeing there is no executive session, we will have about a 20-minute break before the regular session at 6 o'clock. So I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
A motion has been made and seconded to adjourn this meeting. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. This meeting is adjourned.